Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
This time, we're wading into the waters of love and relationships, specifically focusing on those tricky communication snags.
Yes. The land of misinterpreted texts. And what did you mean by that? Looks.
Exactly. We're using this really interesting list of common communication pain points experienced by couples and families. You know, those moments when you're like, wait, are we even speaking the same language?
Exactly. We're going to kind of unpack these issues, give you a little peek behind the curtain of why they happen.
Think of this deep dive as your decoder ring for deciphering those frustrating communication breakdowns.
And the goal is not to dwell on the negative, but to equip you with the tools to build stronger, healthier relationships.
Totally. And while the list focuses on romantic relationships, let's be real, a lot of this applies to family dynamics, friendships, really any close relationship.
Absolutely. Communication is universal.
So, diving right in, one of the first things that grabbed my attention was lack of open communication. Makes sense, right? But sometimes, even when we want to be open, it feels impossible.
Oh, it's way more complex than just wanting to be open. There's so much going on beneath the surface.
Like what?
Well, for starters, think about vulnerability. Opening up means exposing yourself to potential hurt, judgment. That can be terrifying, especially if you've been burned before.
It's like that saying, love is giving someone the power to destroy you, but trusting them not to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then there's the whole fear of conflict. Some people would rather sweep things under the rug than have a difficult conversation.
Which we all know never ends well.
Never. Because then resentment builds, misunderstandings fester, and pretty soon you're living in a minefield of unspoken issues.
And speaking of misunderstandings, the next point on the list is misunderstandings due to poor listening.
Oh, man.
This one hits home. I remember reading this study where couples had to repeat back what their partner just said, and the results were comical.
Hilarious and a little concerning.
Seriously. Like, why are we such terrible listeners sometimes, especially with the people we love the most?
It's a mix of things, you know? We come to conversation with our own baggage, our own anxieties, and sometimes we're so caught up in our own heads that we don't truly hear what the other person is saying.
That's so true. It's like we're just waiting for our turn to talk instead of actually listening.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of communication styles. Some people are very direct, while others are more subtle, and those differences can lead to major misinterpretations.
It's like that whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not just about gender. It's about individual personalities and how we've learned to communicate over time.
You know, this reminds me of a classic communication pitfall. Avoiding difficult conversations. I used to be the queen of avoidance, especially with my ex.
What would happen?
Anytime things got a little heated, I just shut down completely. It was like my brain froze. Looking back, it was pure fear of conflict. I'd rather sweep things under the rug than risk things blowing up.
I see. But in a way, you were risking things blowing up even more by not addressing them.
That's what I learned eventually. Avoiding conflict just lets it simmer and grow, doesn't it?
It does. And it often comes out in other, less healthy ways. Passive aggression, resentment. It's like a pressure cooker.
So tackling those difficult conversations head on is crucial. But how do we do that effectively? This list mentions criticism instead of constructive feedback, which can make those conversations even harder.
Right, because criticism often feels like an attack. It puts people on the defensive.
It makes me think of that saying, it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Exactly. The message might be valid, but the delivery can completely derail the conversation. Constructive feedback is about focusing on specific behaviors, offering solutions, and coming from a place of wanting to help, not hurt.
Okay, so let's say my partner constantly leaves their dirty dishes in the sink. Instead of saying, you're so lazy, you never clean up after yourself. I could try something like,
Exactly. Instead of, you're so lazy. Maybe try something like, hey, I've noticed the dishes piling up in the sink. Could we maybe find a system that works for both of us to keep the kitchen tidy?
It's amazing how a simple shift in phrasing can make such a difference.
Huge difference. It's about collaboration, not condemnation.
And speaking of unhealthy communication, let's talk about the silent treatment. This one can be a real relationship killer. What's the psychology behind using silence as a weapon, and what kind of damage does it inflict?
Silence can be very powerful. Sometimes it's used consciously as a way to control or punish. Other times it's a more subconscious reaction.
Like if you just feel too overwhelmed to speak.
Right, or maybe you haven't learned how to express your emotions in a healthy way. But regardless of the reason, it creates this wall between people. It shuts down communication.
And it sends that message that you don't even think the other person is worth engaging with.
which can be incredibly hurtful and erode trust over time.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the digital age and its impact on communication. I feel like overdependence on digital communication and misinterpreting text messages are a recipe for disaster. What's the line between healthy digital communication and overdependence?
I think the line gets blurry when we start relying on digital communication for conversations that really need that face-to-face connection.
Like what?
Like resolving a conflict, expressing complex emotions, having those deep heart-to-heart conversations where you really need to see the other person's facial expressions, hear the tone of their voice, all those nonverbal cues.
Oh, totally. It's like trying to have a serious conversation through emojis. You're bound to miss something.
Exactly. And then with text messages, emails, all that, there's so much room for misinterpretation. You don't have those nonverbal cues to help you decode the message. A simple phrase like "no problem" can mean a dozen different things depending on the context.
I've been there. Just last week, my friend sent me a text that came off as super sarcastic, and I was ready to unleash World War III. Turns out, she was just teasing, but the text totally lacked that playful tone. Have you seen this a lot, where digital communication leads to major misunderstandings?
All the time. It's so easy for messages to be misconstrued in the digital world. That's why it's crucial to be mindful of your tone when you're communicating digitally. Choose your words carefully, and when in doubt, just pick up the phone or have that conversation face to face.
So what's your advice for avoiding those digital communication disasters?
First, be aware of the potential for misinterpretation. Think about how your message might be received without those nonverbal cues. Second, be clear and concise in your communication. Don't leave room for ambiguity. And finally, don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you're not sure what someone means. A simple, "Hey, just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly," can go a long way.
Great tips. Now this next point on the list feels huge, shoe-y. Lack of empathy during discussions. Are we really listening to understand, or are we just waiting for our turn to talk? How do we become better at truly empathizing with our loved ones, even when we disagree?
Empathy is such a crucial piece of the communication puzzle. It's about stepping outside of your own perspective and trying to see the world through the other person's eyes.
It's about understanding their feelings, even if you don't agree with them.
Exactly. And that requires active listening, asking clarifying questions, and really trying to understand their perspective. It's not about agreeing with everything they say, but rather making an effort to see where they're coming from.
It sounds so simple, but it's so hard to do sometimes.
It is. It takes practice. But it's like anything else, the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Well, after diving deep into all these communication pitfalls, what's the biggest takeaway you want to leave our listeners with today?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. Communication is a skill. And like any skill, it can be learned and improved. By becoming aware of these common pitfalls, we can start to shift our own communication habits and cultivate deeper, more meaningful connections.
And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for you all. What is one small change you can make in your communication today to foster a deeper connection with someone you care about? Maybe it's practicing active listening, being more mindful of your tone in text messages, or simply taking a moment to pause and really consider the other person's perspective before responding. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of communication. We'll be back soon to explore more topics that matter to you.
See you then.